Hello everybody, my name is Grace and today I'm going to continue reading the book Who Was Queen Elizabeth II? Chapter 2 Royal Wedding. Something else was happening during the war years. Elizabeth was falling in love. The young man she fell in love with was a Navy officer. He was 5 years older than she was. But he wasn't just a Navy officer. He was her third cousin and a prince, Prince Philip, the Greek of Denmark. Like many people in Europe's royal families, Philip was related to a lot of kings and queens. He and Elizabeth had the same great-great-grandparents, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. In those days, it was common for royal cousins to marry each other. 13-year-old Elizabeth fell in love with Philip almost from the moment she saw him. He was 6 feet tall, with blue eyes and blonde hair, aesthetic, witty, and handsome. Truly a Prince Charming, but he wasn't rich. Elizabeth's mother thought she could marry someone else, someone with money and land. But Elizabeth had her heart set on Philip. As she got older, Philip fell in love with her too. He joined the Royal Navy in 1933 and sailed around the world during World War II. But he wrote letters to her while he was gone. In the fall of 1946, King and Queen invited Philip to spend a month with them at their favorite castle in Scotland, Balmoral, surrounded by 50,000 acres of beautiful woods and rolling land. It was the place Elizabeth's family went there every summer. There, Philip proposed to Elizabeth, and instantly she said yes. She was 20 years old. She didn't ask her parents for permission, although princesses were supposed to. Her father, the king, insisted Elizabeth keep the engagement secret until she turned 21 the following year. During that time, he taught Elizabeth how to be the queen of the whole British Commonwealth. On her 21st birthday, Elizabeth and her parents and her sister were in South Africa. To celebrate, a huge ball was held in her honor, complete with fireworks. The day was declared a national holiday. The Prime Minister of South Africa gave her a necklace with 21 diamonds in it. A few months later, her engagement to Prince Philip was announced. The royal wedding for Elizabeth and Philip was held on November 20th, 1947. By that time, Philip had given up being Prince of Greek and Denmark. Instead, he was now Duke of Edinburgh. Edinburgh is the capital of Scotland, which is the part of the United Kingdom. It was freezing cold on the morning of the wedding, but didn't stop thousands of people from crowding the streets outside Westminster Abbey, the most famous church in England. The British people were thrilled to celebrate this beautiful beginning after the long, terrible years of war. Elizabeth and her father rode to the church in a gold, black, and red horse-drawn coach. Like in a fairy tale, her dress was covered with crystals and pearls, and the chain for her dress was 15 feet long. Westminster's Abbey was filled with 2,000 guests. The women wore long gowns and gloves. There were more than a dozen kings and queens and princes there. At the ceremony, Elizabeth and Philip rode back to Buckingham Palace in a glass coach. Hundreds of thousands of people stood outside the palace, waiting. Finally, the royal couple arrived, appeared on the balcony of the palace, and waved to the crowds. Back inside, Elizabeth and Philip cut their wedding cake with a sword. The cake was 9 feet tall. The early years of Elizabeth and Philip's marriage were happy ones. Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Prince Charles, on November 14, 1942, at 48. The whole family was there to celebrate. The prince, the prime minister, the leader of the British government was there too. Elizabeth's first child, Prince Charles, was in line to be king of the United Kingdom someday. A year later, Philip was sent by the Navy to Malta, a small island country in the Mediterranean. Elizabeth decided to join him, leaving their 1-year-old son behind. She wanted to spend as much time she could with Philip. In 1950, the second child was born, Princess Anne. Elizabeth wasn't a cold mother, but she wasn't warm and cuddly with their children either. Both Charles and Annie were cared by nannies in London. They spent Christmas with their grandparents, while Elizabeth and Philip were away. Years later, Charles would say that he felt sad as a child because his mother was gone too much. When returning from long trips, she sometimes didn't hug him. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's father, King George VI, was ill. He had planned to travel the world for 6 months to visit Commonwealth countries, but he was too weak, so decided to send Elizabeth and Philip instead. On January 31st, 1952, Elizabeth and Philip flew to Kenya in Africa. It was supposed to be their first stop of many. They spent a night at Treetops, a hotel built up high in the African trees. Elephants roamed below, and Elizabeth took movies of them. While she and Philip were sleeping, Elizabeth's father, who was miles away in England, suddenly died in his sleep. It was February 6, 1952. Elizabeth was now queen, at the age of 25. She was the monarch of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and dozens of other countries and territories around the world. She had never expected to become queen so young, but she was ready. Chapter 3. Long Live the Queen. Elizabeth and Philip immediately flew home to England, where the Prime Minister and other members of the government met them at the airport. They all bowed to Elizabeth as the new Queen of the United Kingdom. At home, that night, her grandmother, Queen Mary, kissed her and kissed her hand. It had always been the other way around. The next day, Elizabeth took a solemn oath in front of several hundred people from the government. In a short speech, she promised to work as hard as her father and for the happiness of her people. Although she was never supposed to cry in public, her eyes was filled with tears by the time she was done. Elizabeth was already queen, but she still had to go through the ceremony called coronation. During the ceremony, the crown would actually be placed on her head. But that wouldn't happen for 16 months. Why? To give everyone time to mourn the dead king before holding a joyous celebration for the new monarch. The funeral for King George VI lasted several days. 300,000 people filed past his coffin in the Parliament building to pay their respects. On the day of the burial, Elizabeth rode with her mother and sister in a carriage behind the coach carrying the coffin. All wore long, heavy black vestals. The coffin was taken through London to Windsor Castle for burial. When the funeral was over, Elizabeth had to start work as the new queen. To her surprise, she immediately felt confident in her job. She felt like a queen right away. Every single day except Christmas Day and Easter Sunday, the young queen had to read important papers that were brought to her in a locked red letter box. The papers told her what's going on in the Parliament. Every week, she met with the Prime Minister for about half an hour. The Queen wasn't supposed to tell the government what it would do. She was supposed to offer advice without being too pushy. Over time, Elizabeth became especially good at this. She asked questions that made prime ministers think hard about what Parliament should do. Elizabeth's first prime minister was Winston Churchill. He was a famous and loved world leader who was more than 53 years older than Elizabeth. He had led the country to World War II to victory. Elizabeth had 14 more prime ministers during her long reign, but Churchill remained her favorite. Elizabeth then became queen. An important question came up. What would her last name be? Women took their husband's last name in those days. Philip's was Mountbatten, but Elizabeth's mother told her to keep her family last name, Windsor. Philip never really got over her decision to do so. The Queen's daily life inside Buckingham Palace soon fell into a routine. At 9 a.m. each morning, she woke up to the sound of bagpipes playing under the bedroom window. She had breakfast in her bedroom, brought by servants, of course. There were also housemaids, footmen, private secretaries, and others to assist with daily chores. For special events, her ladies-in-waiting were on hand. Ladies-in-waiting aren't servants. They were just close friends or cousins. They often went with the Queen when she was out in public. If she needed something, she just stared right at them and they rushed to help. When Elizabeth was in London, she usually saw children twice a day. The Queen played with them a few minutes in the morning. Then they came to visit her in late afternoon, at tea time. After tea, sometimes she helped get them ready for bed. Elizabeth was a kind person, but she had been brought up to believe that her job was as queen. Every other role was less important, including being a mother. At long last, Elizabeth's coronation was held on June 2, 1953. She had practiced every part of the ceremony for weeks. She had to wear a heavy robe with 21-foot-long train while making down the aisles in Westminster Abbey. Her robes weighed 36 pounds, as much as a small child, so she rehearsed in a ballroom with the palace. Of the pallets with sheets that were weighed down and tied to her shoulders. She also practiced wearing the heavy crown. It weighed 5 pounds. Most of the ceremony was shown on TV. Millions of people watched around the world. It was the first time the public had seen a coronation. The day was cold and rainy, but millions of people watched the Queen go by on her way to church. Elizabeth rode in a gold coach. Parades of soldiers and bands marched by. 6 maids of honor waited for her at the church door. Inside Westminster Abbey, the coronation was performed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the very highest religious leader in the Church of England. For one part of the ceremony, Elizabeth's maids of honor removed her robes, gloves, and jewelry. They helped her put on a plain white linen dress over her jewel-encrusted crown. This was the most scared part of the coronation. TV cameras were not allowed to show it. The Archbishop of the Cantor poured holy oil on her palms, head, and heart. It was a way of announcing she was then holy. With the coronation's robe back on, Elizabeth sat on a wooden throne. She was handled the crown jewels, a jewel scepter sword, a gold ball and ring. The scepter was a gold long stick with hundreds of diamonds, including the large clear-cut diamond in the world. The gold ball has a cross on top. The jewels were heavy, but Elizabeth held them perfectly. Finally, the solid gold St. Edward's crown was placed on her head. It was the only time she would wear it. The crown was only for coordinations. At the same time, the other members of nobility in the church put smaller crowns on their own heads. Everyone cried out, "God save the Queen." The coronation lasted nearly 3 hours. When it was over, the Queen took off the St. Edward's crown and put it on a different one. Then she rode through the streets of London so people could see her. Back at the palace, the Queen was joyful. Nothing went wrong. Nothing went wrong, she said happily. When she took off her crown, 5-year-old Charles put on his head. The Queen didn't mind. After all, he would be wearing himself one day. So that's all of chapter 2 and chapter 3, and I will see you next time. Bye!